And this illustrates like the deeper problem, why a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily just about like our capacity to write precise code capable of altering incentive structures or warping games, more broadly speaking, but the actually much harder and deeper work of changing people's minds.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is Andy Tudhope. He is the CTO of LAVA. We are here at DevCon. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much.
What brings you to DevCon?
DevCon is an interesting place to connect with old friends. I think that a lot of the work that we end up doing ends up being quite abstract, and it can, in its technical precision, feel somewhat removed from the human realm.
Mm-hmm.
After all, we are trying to remove intermediaries and build resilient systems that operate in fairly automatic fashions.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the core of that is and ought to be human connection, the ability to form meaningful relationships, both with one another and with the wider world. And so coming together in person is always a neat reminder of that, especially for people who spend most of their time in front of screens.
Mm.
The longer that I've spent in the community, the more important that particular aspect has become. Just reconnecting with old friends, reminding one another what it is that we're all doing here.
Mm.
And the simple but deeply nourishing encouragement that comes from being together.
Mm-hmm. And you are uniquely also doing that with a child in tow, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
How's that experience been?
The child is wonderful because he becomes a way of interacting in the environment that is otherwise not possible. So, in line with the notion of connecting with one another and really reestablishing old bonds, reminding each other what is important and why we're here. The places that those happen, that those kind of reminders tend to be most often enacted, are meaningful conversations around the edges. So it's not the main stage or the big announcement or the latest and most shiny piece of new technology. It's really the look in another person's eyes and the sense of excitement one gets from a new discovery happening together in dialogue. So, being here with my child forces me into those kinds of places anyway, because he's not available for hour-long presentations about data availability sampling or the latest EIP or whatever it is.
Right.
He might have opinions on those. He gives them in 5 minutes and then he wants to leave, And so I am, just by nature of him being here, forced into these more quiet and reflective spaces, which is in any case what I tend to favor. And it's now just 100% of my time in there, rather than being kind of dragged out by technological distraction.
And you talked about kind of what's important, why are we here, what matters. Like, what does that mean to you? Why are you here? What matters to you in this field?
At the highest level, it is about programming money to be meaningful. It might seem that we can do that with tools other than blockchains, although I really tend to doubt it. And the reason revolves around this notion of meaning. Like, where does the meaning in words arise from? It's generally speaking a community of use. One needs a wide enough and diverse enough community using particular words in order for those words to really be imbued with meaning over long periods of time. And so when the financial systems that run the world and within which all of us exist are controlled by only a small handful, then the meaning that we can make with the kinds of money that we use is enormously limited, and it is dependent upon a small group of people. These people are not inherently bad. I don't believe in good and evil as very valuable frameworks for interacting with the world. But I do think that the notion of an open and accessible public ledger, which anybody is able to program and which is limited only by one's capacity to learn and express freely one's own creativity, that structure in and of itself gives us the ability to make and share meanings with money that are not otherwise possible. And those meanings are particularly important in the sense that they might help us become unstuck politically, right? I think a lot of what I teach and a lot of the work upon which I base some of my professional worldview is David Grieber and a particular lens on anthropology. And in the posthumous work with him and David Wengrow, which is called Dawn of Everything, they make the point that really one of the most noticeable differences between us and our ancestors is not our technological sophistication or our intelligence, which actually is roughly the same. It's really that we are far more stuck in a particular form of sociopolitical organization. Our ancestors had a great degree more freedom to experiment with different social forms and often would, dependent on the seasons, dependent on where they moved, dependent upon the nature of the time, and would have well-established rituals and ceremonies and spaces for ritual play in order to experiment with alternative social forms, whether it's the making or various forms of inversion that would occur throughout the year, to remind people that the power structures that we exist within are ultimately arbitrary and conventional. This doesn't trivialize them and doesn't mean that they don't exist, but conventions can be transcended, right? And it seems to me that a large part of what prevents us from really exploring those possibilities in the modern world is a sense of the inevitability of a particular kind of political power structure that is dependent upon 4-year elections or 10-year elections or various forms of an ultimately similar thing, which has a few group of an elite group of leaders dictating policy for a large group of followers. And the possibility, once again, of having really meaningful money, which it depends upon a wide community of use and a great diversity and plurality of inputs, is precisely the thing that would enable us to think about wider political systems that potentially give meaningful and valuable voice to radically different groups of people, cultures, beliefs, ways of being in the world. And it's in that sense that I imagine some kind of alignment with life, right? Because I think it's a curious catchphrase, because life for me is this multi-dimensional, multivariable matrix of different possibilities, right? It spreads everywhere in these excessive and unpredictable ways that always escape your definition and lead you inevitably into some kind of performative contradiction when you try and talk about it. And so what is the way that we can build systems, particularly financial and political, that are somehow in alignment with that? We don't. We create the conditions for that to grow of itself. And those conditions require the capacity for unpredictable learning and unpredictable teaching, for creative expression, for programmability in ways that others have not been able to imagine because they are limited by their backgrounds or cultural conditioning to think about politics and power in very particular kinds of ways. So I just think that notion of becoming unstuck by virtue of programming money to be meaningful, once again, is enormously deep and powerful. And I see in it a promise of harmony with life that is otherwise not really possible.
Yeah. You said a lot there. One of the particular threads I'm curious about, how, like, what I've been thinking about more recently as well, is just this immutability value, these smart contracts, this encryption that kind of creates this sense of, trust in a really sturdy sense. Like, we can trust the math, but these possible runaway incentive structures, let's take Bitcoin, for example. Like, it's hard to displace the current network and growth, but like many would argue that energy consumption is not an optimal design for how we do our base level currencies. Could we enter a world with blockchains not only being successful, but too successful, where they become kind of runaway, where this same challenge of getting stuck in a 4-year election cycle or getting caught in, a perpetual pattern is actually just recreated now with even more hegemonic infrastructure that we can't control? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, of course, right? The simple answer to that. And you see it happening already. But the key is in this notion of the conventional and arbitrary nature of power structures, right? So one could alter the Bitcoin proof of work algorithm or even the sacred cow of 21 million coins with a single line of code, right? A single PR to the Bitcoin GitHub repo would do it. The point is that that doesn't fly because of social convention. And as soon as that is front and center of the kind of narratives that we tell, the possibility for play remains open, right? Robin Williams used to say that the world is open for play. All of it, it's all made up, right? And this is not to trivialize it or to descend into nihilism because, the world is Maya and illusion and therefore I don't have to interact. No, we must of necessity participate. We are alive and we are embodied beings. We are called to respond in so many different kinds of ways. But that doesn't mean that we ought to forget the conventional nature of how the world often presents itself to us. And so even the notion of immutability is a narrative. It's not really true, right? Any of it can be changed with large enough social consensus. The DAO hard fork in Ethereum is one very practical example of this. But if you think more widely about the narratives that have been told throughout human history, the notion of permanence is roundly criticized, one might say, throughout all of the deep stories, right? Everything is impermanent. Everything changes all of the time. Any kind of real inquiry and observation of the world reveals that simple fact very obviously just in the nature of your own lived experience, right? Nothing is permanent. And so what's fascinating is that a large part of the frontier technology worlds are now telling the story of immutability and permanence and saying that nothing is permanent and basing it, either in Buddhist teachings or various other spiritual traditions, which have realized that nothing is really permanent, is not to denigrate the claim of immutability and permanence. It's just to hold these two in generative tension, right? And to recognize the conventional nature of any narrative that we tell. Because in so doing, you can find creative ways around it.
But to that point, I mean, finding the creative ways around it, yes, you can commit a line of code to the Bitcoin repo. But the reason many would argue that's not practical is because of the incentive structure that underlies those power dynamics, where, and similar in a proof of stake system, arguably you can change things, but because people have capital at stake, they choose to essentially operate within those incentives of they don't want to lose that capital or they want to grow that capital, right? And that economic incentive is what is underpinning and part of the breakthrough here, right? That these decentralized trust systems can exist because of economic incentives. So yeah, help me understand how that fits within this framework. I understand you're not trying to trivialize the power structures, but is that space for play really so flexible?
My claim is that it's as flexible as we make it, but you're right to point at the practical reality of the economic incentive structures which exist at this particular point in time. I think that, the technical way of framing what you're saying is that the real power of these kinds of networks is the ability to make durable commitments, durable and economically meaningful commitments, right? Because those kinds of commitments, technically speaking, are what allow us to warp games, right? So like in game theory, you basically have the chance to either cooperate or defect. There are other moves in more complicated games, but just the basic games, cooperate and defect. And when you can warp games, you could change the nature of the incentive structures in them to, either like lean more towards cooperation or more towards defection. And credible commitments of a meaningful economic kind allow you to warp games towards, generally speaking, better forms of cooperation. That takes a long time, and it inevitably faces up against the reality of economic incentives as they exist in the wider world. And that reality can feel overwhelming. In my mind, is what results in a lot of the cognitive dissonance that technologists experience who work with this particular technology, precisely because it feels so urgent and because we need to go about changing the financial structure of incentives in the world, and yet doing so is generational work. Right? Bayo Kamalafe, I think even on this podcast, said that the times are urgent. We really need to slow down. And that capacity to hold contradiction can really be very challenging, particularly when you're working on like the precise code, which can shift the incentive structures, but of course you have to get people to buy into them, right? And this illustrates like the deeper problem, why a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily just about like our capacity to write precise code capable of altering incentive structures or warping games, more broadly speaking, but the actually much harder and deeper work of changing people's minds. And I'm reminded of a conversation between Sadhguru and Vitalik Buterin, which was a wonder to watch for various different reasons. And Sadhguru at one point tells a story about a project that he has been running to plant trees in Uttar Pradesh because of the pending ecological crisis there. And the goal was to plant 140 million trees in 20 years. It's now 24 years later, and they've only planted 80 million trees. I say only because they didn't reach the goal, right? Because the incentive structures in the world are just enormously difficult to move against. But they still planted 80 million trees, and that has made a significant difference to all kinds of ecological indicators in Uttar Pradesh. And the reason that he gave was what was most fascinating to me. He said that the project was delayed by 6 to 8 years because for those 6 to 8 first years, I had to spend planting trees in people's minds. And that's the most difficult and dangerous of territories, right? Literally, and he means it literally, he's not speaking mystically. He literally had to take people to go and sit beneath trees and lead a particular kind of meditation where you breathe in the oxygen from the tree and breathe out the carbon dioxide that the tree needs to photosynthesize food. And you really, in your own body, feel the cycle of air moving through like this shared ecology. And for 6 to 8 years, that's what they did before people of their own accord started planting trees, right? And it's the same thing here, right? You're absolutely right. Like people are locked in to economic incentives for all sorts of reasons, many of them quite noble and well-intentioned, supporting my family, paying school fees, supporting the community, making sure my rates and taxes are paid, my mortgage is kept up, whatever it is, right? Like all of these are valid reasons for remaining within the economic system that exists. And when you really get to know people and understand the nuances of their life, you can't judge, right? Like that's in some sense the root of compassion, right? Is knowing that like if I were you, I would not do an atom's worth of difference. And so given that, like what do we do? Right? Because it's not just the code that one writes. As you say, yeah, sure, PR to the repo and it's done. But that doesn't get merged because of all of the psychological and socio-political structures that exist, which are much, much more difficult to change and in fact require generational work, right? Like it's not the work of one generation to undo the system that we find ourselves with, because that system has been generated often with good intention by a long line of ancestors. The work here is to understand what brought us to this moment and to think about the nature of the commitments required to warp the games that we are playing towards slightly more cooperative and pro-social outcomes that are aligned with life. And like, that's a very interesting, like what are those commitments? Because they're like both of the technical kind. You need to be able to write a program in a particular kind of way, which expresses ideas about power and value that are different to the ones that currently exist. But you also need to be able to tell narratives and share human relationships and wider than human relationships, which of themselves are a kind of commitment, right? You will know that in any number of different storytelling traditions or wisdom traditions around the world, that notion of commitments or vow is critical to anything really moving in the world. And it's the same thing, right? Like we forget, because all of a sudden the language in which the commitment or the vow is enacted is something like solidity as opposed to English, but it's the same basic structure. And what is required perhaps at this point is an understanding that, it's commitments across the stack that need to be made, both those that are narrative, like what's happening in this podcast, people really being able to kind of explore in dialogue what are the stories and the narratives and the ways of relating to ourselves and the wider world that we need to form in order to have a more healthy self and world. And it's the same conversation between technologists. It just takes place in a slightly different language. And so those commitments are really like the key to the whole thing, because when one commits with heart, one is able to transcend convention. Right? There's something really important about the relationship to sort of seeing convention as it is and being able to transcend it, and recognizing that the mechanism by which that actually happens is sort of heartful commitment.
So your work spans a number of different terrains, I guess, but I've understood it to somewhat have this frame of mechanism design. And I think you're alluding to that in terms of these commitments. Can you say more about this framing of mechanism design, and then maybe walk us through a bit of context of how you've been engaging in this field of inquiry, and then maybe we can look ahead a little bit at what's exciting you?
Sure. Mechanism design is often imagined as only a field of sort of scientific or engineering application. Right? It's like one is trying to, through the lens of particularly game theory, understand the incentive structures behind any interaction which power any behavior, and think carefully about the kinds of constraints which might alter those incentives and result in a different kind of behavior. But even by virtue of that description, you'll see that it cannot be limited to only science and engineering. It's not just about the nature of the code one writes. It's also about the kind of story you tell about what that code is and how it should be used. So Bitcoin has a very particular story about immutability and permanence and deflationary monetary theory, right? That resonates with some people, particularly those that are exposed to highly inflationary currencies, which are controlled by corrupt and centralized governments. But it's not the only way of thinking about healthy financial systems or monetary theory writ large. And the reason for that is because science and engineering in and of themselves are not able to capture the full nuance and range of ambiguity held in the human experience. And so for me, the journey into mechanism design has been one of trying to understand the multidisciplinary nature of the field and then learn the skills required to apply contextually different kinds of skills when necessary. For instance, one of the most inhumane and asymmetric systems that exists on the planet at the moment is the US penal system. And one of the things that happens in this particular system is that prisoners can accrue debt while they're behind bars for child services, restitution payments, any number of things. And yet, while behind bars, you're not allowed to work and earn a salary. Once you are released, you're expected to repay these debts. They're called legal financial obligations.
And often the minimum wage laws don't apply to the work you are doing behind bars.
Exactly. Right. That's another whole thing to explore about this particular system. But the LFLs is what I'll focus on for this. And, once you're released, you're not easily hireable. And yet you are expected to repay your debt, and failure to repay your LFLs can result in reincarceration. So it's not even about recidivism, about repeating crimes. It's if you just can't get a job and can't pay your debt, you're put back into the jail system, which is designed to make a profit mostly for private companies. And knowing this, we can think about how might we program money to be more meaningful in the face of such an inhumane system. It's not about like a global question of sort of like a more healthy financial system writ large. It's just like, are there particular things that we can do to address the deep asymmetries and the resulting inhumane function of this particular system?
Mm-hmm.
To which the answer is obviously yes. And the mechanism that we built adapts what is a particular auction contract built by a team called Zora, and will generate NFTs based on prisoner artwork. It will sell those NFTs at auction. Once the artwork is sold, it is frozen. The funds that it was bought for sent to a 501c3 based in Florida, run by a man who used to be the director of the Florida Department of Corrections, who pays the LFOs on behalf of the prisoner who made the artwork, and receipts for those payments, which are often to state entities, are then attached to the artwork when it is finally transferred to the original buyer, so that the economic story of this person's restoration to society and the inherent human dignity that is encapsulated and creativity that is encapsulated in any work of art are moved simultaneously on chain, right? Like that's the great benefit in some sense of like blockchains at this particular level of analysis, is that they merge money and speech, right? That you can have in the same moment both an artistic statement and an economic fact occurring, right? One of the women for whom we did this had been incarcerated, as it turns out, incorrectly when she was pregnant with twins. She gave birth in prison. One of them died, the other survived. The artworks that we auctioned off included a painting by her 1-year-old son when when he was allowed his first visit with her. And the fees raised from that particular sale went towards child services, and the judge at her hearing was so impressed that she'd made an effort to pay that which was outstanding, although they didn't cover all of it because she owed like $150,000 or something really quite ridiculous, meant that he canceled her debt and kept her free. And so we built a mechanism that kept a woman free and with her family. And it's a tiny and insignificant thing, right? Like this is not a world currency that has got the attention of, people on every single continent and got them thinking about permanence and immutability and a new financial system. It's a tiny little thing. It's a drop in the ocean.
I bet it meant the world to her.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's one drop of truth is enough to justify an ocean of lies, right? It's that kind of that if you can do something for one person, you've done an amazing thing, because as it turns out, just to help one other being is virtually impossible to really help them, because help itself has this patronizing power dynamic, which inevitably lands you up in performative contradictions and leads to you reenacting the same patterns of power that we're trying to act against. But just occasionally, with the right kind of combination of science and engineering and narrative and contextual awareness of where it can be applied in appropriate ways in the world, we find the ability to potentially make a difference. And it's that kind of thing that I'm interested in. There are other mechanisms that I've designed, which are interesting in their own ways, but keeping Sammy free was probably one of the most meaningful things that I've done in 10 years of working in the industry.
Nice. So what's grabbing your attention now? Like what's most alive for you? We're recording this at the end of 2024.
So the majority of my work has really been involved with currency design. Mechanism design is like sort of a broader term. Currency, more specifically, part of that universe. And I think that even within sort of currency design, there is an entire programmable universe of possible currencies that we can design. And generally speaking, we're limited by our own cultural conditioning, right? And background, experiences, education, that kind of stuff, and narrows our attention to a very small part of that universe. I've been involved with lots of different projects that have taken different approaches to, using collateralized debt positions to make coins pegged to the US dollar, or trying to instantiate locally exchange traded systems on chain, or thinking about community currencies or rotational labor associations, or older forms of human organization and how they might be instantiated in this new digital technology. And the thing to me that seems to stand out the most is an ability to focus on the liabilities side of the balance sheet, right? Bitcoin is all about the assets. And that was necessary, especially post the global financial crisis and the kind of mania around debt that was primarily responsible for it. And so naturally you have the swinging of the pendulum back, and like, oh, you can only do assets on this network, and it's all about ownership, and not your keys, not your coins, and kind of off we go in the opposite direction from whatever caused 2007, 2008. But accounting is this like really beautifully balanced thing. You've got you've literally got balance sheets, right? My dad is an accountant. He always says it's so simple. You just debit one thing and you credit another thing, right? He ran a bank with that ideology. I know that there are moments when it seems more complicated than that, but ultimately that's what it boils down to. And there's always the sense of balance in things. And of necessity, post the GFC, there's not been the same kind of balanced and nuanced approach to thinking about finance and the systems that we use. And we have tended to focus more on the assets than on anything else. And yet the real power exists in the liability side of the balance sheet, because you and I might be able to exchange assets of any kind, not just digital tokens, quite freely. But the thing that we can't do, and which is limited to an elite group of players, is clear massive debts with small amounts of money. Right. And one only gets to that by focusing on the liability side of the balance sheets. Some of my own work speaks to this, but the thing that's probably most exciting in the world right now is something called Cycles. It's built by an old collaborator of mine called Ethan Buchman. He's a wonderful person. You should interview him. And Ethan is really focused on kind of defunding the dealers, right? Like, how is it that we can form clearing protocols between ordinary people and enable us to do in a great degree more trade and transaction and clear significantly more debts with much less money, right? And the reason that this is exciting is because the majority of people who work in the industry that I do are focused on liquidity and liquidity provision. And honestly, liquidity by this point is some kind of mystical term to me. I really don't know if I understand what people mean when they say that word. And Ethan seems to be one of the only people who's thinking really critically and at a deep level about, like, the thing is not to think about liquidity and how we might lower LVR for different LPs that are using AMMs on chain and throw like 1,000 more stupid acronyms at the thing. It's to think about how we might actually enable more people to do more with less, right? So again, that's a very deep story, right? And yes, it's enacted in enormously technical ways of necessity in the modern world, but the story is very, very simple, right? Like, how can people do more, interact with more, but do so with less, right? And that's basically what Cycles does. The idea is that you make a massive graph of everybody's obligations, and then you net those obligations off against one another.
Right.
And this is an enormously powerful way of clearing massive amounts of debt without needing a lot of currency.
So I'm let's say I run a bakery and I have liabilities to different suppliers, maybe to the government, to some staff. The staff also has liabilities and different obligations across their relationships and economic arrangements. And, if you graph all of these different types of arrangements, you can essentially then find where, you owe this person this, and you owe this person this, but they owe this person. And, I don't know, I'm speaking outside of my expertise here, but you can essentially consolidate those liabilities and obligations outstanding by finding those common linkages. And, this is afforded by having money on chain, or the digitization of all these arrangements where you can actually see them. That's the basic premise, is
Yes,
that right?
exactly. And it's how what are called real-time gross settlement systems have always worked, which is how the central bank in countries nets the amounts outstanding between merchant banks at the end of every day. So this is basically what Fedwire does in the States. It's the same across the world. But the point is that only merchant banks and specifically licensed institutions have access to that kind of functionality, right? And this work is to try and open up that access to ordinary people, because it's what enables us to do more with less, which is hopefully the point, right? Like, we don't want to dollarize the world, and we don't want to have a proliferation of tokens that end up requiring more attention and more anxiety from more people, right? Like, the point of this is not to get people obsessed with the ownership economy, right? Which is such a misnomer and is the particular narrative pushed by a very particular kind of American VC, right? This is not to judge it necessarily, but it is the instantiation in the blockchain world of what the Native Americans once called wetiko, right? Which is this disease of the spirit that fed on greed and the need for accumulation, right? So the notion that this is all about read, write, own, and ownership is just fundamentally pathological, right? And it's not to judge the people who push that particular way of looking at things. It's just to notice that, when the Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives there noticed that these people were rich in material goods, but really poor in relationships and time. And those are the only two things that matter, right? You come into this world with nothing and you leave with nothing. The only thing that counts in some really deep sense is the way that you are able to love and be loved, and the kind of time you can spend doing that, right? And read, write, own just, it focuses only on the asset side of the balance sheet, and it is itself therefore pathological, right? Whereas looking into our shadows, looking into the obligations we necessarily have as embodied beings in this world yields much more interesting results, right? The goal is ultimately to have some kind of balance, but the recognition that we are always obliged from the moment that we enter this world is a really, really deep one and necessary for any kind of maturation or wisdom. David Grieber was very, very clear about this, in Debt, the first 5,000 years. It's all about this particular thing and the moral ambiguity inherent in the notion of obligation or liability, because who really is in moral peril, the debtor or the creditor? And you kind of move through this process in life where you're indebted to your parents, and so you yourself become a parent, and you're indebted to your teachers, so you learn how to teach, and you're indebted to the sages, so you endeavor to become wise. And if you make it to wisdom, which, is a very blessed thing to endeavor for, then perhaps you realize that actually you were never in debt at all, because it's all a mirror. It's a reflection of who you are. And, that kind of narrative is difficult to find in Web3 and blockchains, precisely because it's only focused on the assets. And Ethan and a few others are really kind of inquiring into and excavating out, what is the power inherent in thinking about our obligations? And it turns out that it's a very practical power, right? It is the ability to settle huge amounts of debt with virtually no currency. And if we can do that, we don't have to worry about liquidity provision. We don't have to think about impermanent loss or loss versus rebalancing, or all of the problems that come about not as some feature of bad implementation of new financial technologies like automated market makers, but by virtue of the nature of their very architecture and design, right? These things are interesting in some respects, but they suffer from a fundamental imbalance. And that imbalance prevents the wise operation of financial tools, and therefore the flow of value in a way which is really harmonic with life.
Right. Yeah, I love it. I mean, I love that you are framing it so clearly, focus on the liabilities, not just the assets. It reminds me also of the readings. I think Eisenstein and Graeber both talk about, these debt jubilees that used to exist. And we've forgotten that in this current incarnation of culture and capitalism, globalization. But that was an important part of our history, releasing of debts. It also reminds me of the discussions around nature debt swaps, essentially kind of starting from a recognition that we often have global north countries being the creditor and often global south sitting on huge remaining vast lands of outstanding ecological assets and biodiversity hotspots and so forth owing money, and this kind of opportunity to rethink our arrangements globally in terms of the ecological commons and the ecosystem services that are provided and the release of debts. And there's interesting things emerging there in the conservation space that it feels like as the monetary system goes into unsustainable growth trajectory that it's on in terms of its debt itself, we have to get a bit more thoughtful about this discussion of debts. Curious if that provokes anything.
Yeah, the thing that is most thoughtful about Cycles and Ethan's work is that it uses debt as an enabler, right? Like the core feature of the narrative aspect of the work is that, hey, if you think about and are explicit about that which you owe, it can enable you to settle more with less, and also enable everybody else to whom you are indebted to do the same thing, right? Like the interconnected graph through which we're doing like what is called a flow optimization problem to find the best way in which we can settle all of the debts using the least money. Both enables me to just like net all the things that I owe and ultimately owe less, as well as doing so for all of my neighbors in the graph. Right? And the thing that is really difficult to the incentive structure that is difficult to swim upstream against when thinking about debt swaps and even like global north and global south sort of trade imbalances, one might say, is that it inherently relies upon narratives of guilt and historical complicity. Those are very true, right? But they are enormously difficult psychological structures to work within, and enormously difficult psychological structures to craft meaningful narrative around that will get people to change their behaviors. So Ethan's work is interesting because it doesn't really touch on those. It's just like, okay, like be explicit about what you owe to whom, and we will help you owe less, right? And that is very appealing to people, even within the current economic standards and systems, right? Like my own work does like something similar, but it's more exploratory with currencies, right? Because of the nature of my background in education, I knew that community currencies tend to exhibit this kind of half-life decay over time, and that locally exchanged traded systems, particularly those implemented in functional languages, which have kind of infinite recursion of the types of different coins that you can have within them, also are very difficult to use for people because there's so much psychological overhead to tracking different kinds of currencies. And it used all of this to say, well, why don't we just adapt the ERC20 standard, which is the most common token standard on Ethereum, and say, instead of having these tokens represent assets, good things to have, let's have them represent liabilities, obligations, bad things to have, right? And not really bad, but in the language of current economics, bad things to have. And what results from that is a really interesting economic system, but one that is much, it's a few steps further down the line of kind of like psychological exploration of what money is and how it might look if it were truly programmable than Ethan's work. Because Ethan's work is just like, no, let's plug into QuickBooks, which is accounting software used by hundreds of thousands of SMEs across the world. Let's just enable them to be explicit about who they owe what to, and let's settle more of their debts without them having to have like cash on hand, and let's sell it as a cash flow solution, right? That like, it makes really good sense right now, right? Like some of my work is like, well, why don't you just tell a different story about what your money is fundamentally? And, that's interesting. And I've been able to implement it in code, and it will be there forever on Ethereum. But it seems like, it requires like a few more steps before people might be willing to go to that level of investigation, both within themselves, but also just as a collective, right? Like you can't expect people to go from, let's, optimize for me and mine and what I can get out of the system in order to protect what I love, right? Because it's ultimately like people are generally speaking well-intentioned. To, well, like let's just have a monetary system that tracks my liabilities and my obligations and does so in an interesting way that forces me to always be consensual about the nature of my transactions and to pay particular attention to what is called the pricing efforts, which is kind of like more of my work. But the reason that I'm more excited about Ethans and why I wanted to focus on that is because it's just more legible in the world as it exists at the moment. But as I say, it's still quite close to our current conceptualization of what currency and money is. And there is this whole programmable universe that exists. My work is kind of like, let's go and point a lens and see what stars we can see kind of further out there as ways of thinking about where we might go in the future. Because certainly cycles is incredible, but it's not enough. It's not enough to do the kinds of things that you're talking about, because there does need to be a shared investigation of, how do we like protect that which is most valuable to life, which is not just me and my family and the people that I know, but also includes that. And how do we balance the inevitable ties of history with our indistinguishable hopes for the future? Like that kind of stuff really needs to happen. It just seems like discovering the combination of narratives and codes that can allow us to do so is, as I say, it's generational, right? It's like it's not just the work of this time. It's been received from at least 600 years of quite traumatic history. And it will take a long time to unwind all of that, right?
Yeah. Well, if people want to read the white paper, I think it's at cycles.money. Is that the website? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And we'll put links in the show notes as well to that work. And yeah, looking forward to having Ethan on the show at some point. He's been a huge influence in this space for good. So I wanted to ask you, because I know you're also working on LAVA, and we met through our mutual brother, Yosef Ayala, and doing work around Web3 in Africa. And can you share more about this part of what's got you excited?
Sure. The first and most important one is the human relationships, the people who build anything to do with blockchains or Web3 in Africa tend to be really fascinating and to have overcome in their own lives any number of obstacles, which is just really deeply inspiring. It is certainly the truth that crypto needs Africa, not the other way around, because Africa is a place that culturally really understands this notion of reciprocity, really understands what Ubuntu actually is and how it's practiced in a day-to-day cultural format, really understands how these technologies might be usefully applied to serve the communities that use them and not just for individual accumulation, which has never really been a part of the cultural fabric of that place. So it's always about the people, right? On a like more global and abstract level, a lot of the work that I was doing prior to joining Yosef was aimed at research and development of network incentive structures that would help foster geographic decentralization. Because what has happened, even with proof of stake in Ethereum, is that we have seen a massive centralization of power in unexpected ways. And what that means is that the people who are doing the really sophisticated work on the network of ordering transactions and building the blocks that hold the most profitable orders are an enormously small, elite, privileged group of people, right? So like we've just routed power in a slightly different direction. We haven't fundamentally changed its structure. And so you'll find that the blocks on Ethereum are built by 3 different groups of people, and that the people who are searching for valuable orderings of those transactions are also only just a handful. And there are enormous economic incentives for those people, as well as the relays which move blocks around the world, to all be co-located in the same area. This area happens to be Western Europe and the east coast of the United States. Surprise, surprise, right? And that is a result of the fact that the most valuable trades, the biggest trades, which move the markets the most, are generated in those 2 areas. And so the economic forces that lead to centralization of critical infrastructure around that are virtually inevitable, but not quite, right? And the way that we can act against that we can find other places for ritual play and ceremonial investigation of what distributed power might actually look like at the network level, is by creating applications that generate meaningful order flow in other parts of the world. Now, there are like global and abstract ways of attending to that problem, which are meaningful and necessary. But there are also like local and targeted ways of doing that. And that's exactly what LAVA is doing in some respect, right? Like by fostering and coordinating meaningful and interesting projects on the African continent. One of the outcomes of that work, if done well, would be significant order flow being generated in Africa, which means that there is the incentive to actually locate infrastructure there, which has all sorts of beneficial effects on the network, from sort of regulatory resilience to making sure that playing latency games is not the most profitable way of participating in the network, to helping with censorship resistance. There's just like any number of reasons that geographic decentralization like is the thing which matters most about all of these networks. And there's a number of different ways of going about that. Because of my personality, I first went to kind of like the global deep tech solutions, but luckily Joseph pulled me away from that and has me focused on like really targeted intervention in critical areas, and trying to foster coordination and collaboration in those places that can lead to the same effect, but perhaps more directly.
Nice. Well, super exciting. We've got Joseph coming back to the show later today, so we'll dive in more to the work of LAVA. But yeah, it seems like you guys are lucky to have found each other, and I can understand now the synergy a bit better as well. Kind of getting to the hour, but I'm curious what you make of this conversation around regenerative finance. And you've kind of obviously done a little bit of prep in terms of how we're framing things as a show. And yeah, like how do you see this conversation around nature, climate, environmental funding intersecting with like mechanism design, what's happening on Ethereum, the refi community and crypto, like any of those kind of provocations? Just curious your thoughts.
Regenerative is the etymology of the word refers to a spiritual experience, which is very interesting. And the reason for me that seems important is that it's like any kind of meaningful regeneration seems to have to do with recognition of the living spirit that exists around us, right? Like irrespective of tradition or story or whatever kind of resonates most with you. Lewis Hyde kind of calls it the spirit of the gift, right? And he gives all of these presentations about gift giving and Maori culture and all across the world. And he goes in like this long kind of anthropological, socio-political exploration of gifts. And the outcome of which is that, there is such a thing as the spirit of the gift. And people then ask him after these presentations, well, Lewis, that's great. Thank you very much. How can we use this in the world? And he says, no. Just to know that there is such a thing as the spirit of the gift is enough. To know that it is possible to experience every moment of life as a gift is enough. Because if you really think about that, it's like a very confronting challenge. Right? Like can you, in the most difficult, stressful, distracted, dispersed moments of your life, like, oh, this is a gift too, right? It's very easy when things are good and going well. But in every moment, and not even just the most difficult one, like the most boring and ordinary one, making a cup of tea or walking up the stairs, or whatever it is, like gift, right? Is that the background of your life, right? It's his kind of provocation. And the same thing seems to be true of like, regenerative seems to point at that, right? Like, are you constantly recognizing, remembering, right? Like putting through your mental filters the way that you perceive the world, that there is spirit, right? Because that seems to me foundational to both the technical and narrative work, right? Like you have to. It requires a living faith in the God of love, right? like irrespective of what you think of those particular words, there's like a very deep vibrational experience of that, of living spirits or love, or Paul Tillich calls it the courage of faith, right? And he's talking. He wrote a whole book called The Courage to Be, and he goes through the kind of like the courage of despair, which is that of the mystic, and you can kind of look into emptiness and impermanence and shunyata and some of the stuff I've been kind of hinting at, and face the despair, and then stand alone with the alone, stand at the end of time, right? And really face the reality of that and integrate it into your experience. And that's great, but like it doesn't do the whole thing, because the courage of despair of the mystic doesn't take into itself concrete doubt, right? Like real, genuine human doubt. It just kind of like bypasses that. It's not important. It's only one, right? And then you have the courage of acceptance in his language, which is more of the Christian thing, right? It's like the courage to accept that you are acceptable, even though you know you're not, right? It's the personal encounter with God. So it's not kind of staring into the void. It's really meeting God, some might say. But that too, like, it doesn't take seriously like the meaninglessness, right? To say, oh no, well, I met God and it's fine. But there's real, genuine meaninglessness in the world, and it's not about integrating that into yourself in a way which makes it meaningful. It's about like letting the meaningless really be meaninglessness, right? And he calls that the courage of faith. He says that this is the courage of Jesus on the cross when he cries out like, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? Like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? There's a man directly connected by, any version of the story that you listen to, whether it's in the Bible or the Quran or wherever, directly connected. And even he doubts, right? And Paul Tillich says, like, this is the courage of faith, which appears when the God above God has come, when the God of hope has disappeared, and the God after that appears, right? Because like it's fascinating to see that like the people who have made such impact in history themselves have all gone through like enormous doubts, right? Like genuine and deep doubts, and yet come back to this courage of faith, because once hope and fear are all out of the way, right? There's just the seeing that like everything is spirit, right? And not in a way which bypasses the fact that there is emptiness and meaninglessness in spirit, right? Which is the most difficult thing to really grasp. And so it's a roundabout answer of giving you a roundabout way of giving you an answer about regeneration. But that, to me, seems to be what is really like the essential question that is being asked: is can we, who want to see regenerative mechanisms and regenerative work happening in the world, understand both the despair that comes from looking into like the meaninglessness of things as they happen and move with that, as well as understand that the world is living with vital spirits, and that the real truth is beyond both of those things, right? And exists really in some kind of encounter, which is excessive and unspeakable and unpredictable, and all of the things that Bayo Komalafe says, right? He's just got like a list of these wonderful adjectives that really leave you feeling quite bewildered by the end of them. But it's that, right? Like it's neither despair nor hope. It's faith that is not blind, that is not about accepting authority, that is not about rejecting all of the questions inherent in your own nature. It's a faith that encapsulates all of that and then goes beyond to simply like do the thing that you are called to do, to respond in the way that you're a question that is asked by the universe and you are called to respond. Right? And the question is like, how will you respond? And that's like the regenerative question, right? Will you leave the world a little bit better than you did? Will you leave it with no trace, or will you leave it a little bit where there's a whole spectrum of possible responses? And it seems to me that like the regenerative thing is, how do we lean more towards this edge of the spectrum, that is, leave it slightly better, but do so not because it's the right thing to do or a good thing to do or a righteous thing to do or any of that kind of stuff, just because doing so has its own autopoetic joy. It is for its own reason. Right, like one moves through all of the stages of death not because you want to be a better person, or not even because you want to become wise, just because the movement through that is its own joy, right? Like, you'll never receive validation or recognition or acknowledgement from the world unless, like, the world specifically needs that particular reflection. And you don't do it for that kind of stuff. You do it because to do so, it makes your heart sing. And the world needs more people whose hearts are singing. I think that's kind of what I hope regeneration is ultimately about, because all of the other stuff depends on it, right? I could have given you a much more like technical and specific answer. It's this mechanism, and DMRV can be done in this particular way, but all of that depends upon, like, can you be with living spirit and despair and have the courage of a faith which goes beyond both, to just act in the way that you're called to, and do so joyfully without expectation of return.
Andy, thank you. This was a great conversation. Really enjoyed speaking with you and hearing your amazing way with words and navigating so many different ideas and bringing different things together. It's been beautiful. Any final words you want to share?
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. To dive more into Andy's work, just go to andytudhope.africa. You might also be interested in the conversation we had here at DevCon with Jambi Jurage from Grassroots Economics around commitments and commitment pools, and how that kind of gives us a glimpse into future mechanism design for regenerative money and currencies. All of our discussions are available at maearth.com. Thanks for being with us.